Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the last Dean's Forum of the spring. And in fact, we should be very careful to identify exactly what type of Dean's Forum this is. Deans. Welcome all of you to the Dean's Forum, and of course, this is Deans in the plural, possessive plural, not possessive singular. This is the Dean's Forum with the two of you up here. Welcome. Imagine for a moment a small room, stone walls, a narrow window, light coming in at an angle. A writer sits at a table, the world has contracted. And yet a letter begins. It reaches outward to friends, to a community, to a future still imagined. What emerges is not only testimony, but reflection, argument, even resistance. The conditions are constrained, but the intellectual life continues. This is, of course, the world that we enter into with the letter from prison, this wonderful work that we will be discussing today. This is the world we enter into in the letter from prison, a world in which confinement does not end thought, but reshapes it. I'm very pleased to welcome so many of you here for this gathering. All of you, in fact, I'm eager to welcome you. Yeah, it is true. Some not quite sure. Many of you, most of you, perhaps all of you, here for this gathering of the Divinity School's Dean's Forum, again, the plural possessive, a series designed to bring the work of our faculty into conversation, faculty and emeritus faculty, with one another, with our students, and with the wider public. Today's forum features Clark Gilpin, Margaret E. Burton Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of the History of Christianity and Theology, and Dean of the Divinity School from 1990 to 2000, discussing his recent book, The Letter from Prison, Literature of Cultural Resistance in Early Modern England. The volume examines a body of writing produced under conditions of confinement, asking how literary and religious expression persist and take form under pressure. Responding today is Richard Rosengarten, Associate Professor of Religion and Literature and Dean of the Divinity School from 2000 to 2010. You see, you got the point, the Dean's Forum, plural possessive, whose work explores the intersections of theology, literary form, and of course, Dean Charles is sitting right there. Welcome, Morris, Dean of Rockefeller. Responding today is Richard Rosengarten, Associate Professor of Religion and Literature. Dean Culp, we have so many deans here today. Where is Dean Culp? Responding today, without further ado, is Richard Rosengarten, Associate Professor of Religion and Literature, Dean of the Div School from 2000 to 2010, whose work explores the intersections of theology, literary form, and historical context. Thank you all for being here, and please join me in welcoming these two august figures in the history of our school.
So it's an honor to participate in Dean Robinson's forum on this splendid book. Clark Gilpin has been reading and pondering these letters for just over 2 decades, and it shows throughout in his masterful marshaling of detail, his skillful interweaving of relevant scholarship. Foucault and Ricoeur complement each other beautifully here. We hear along the way from Carlo Ginzburg and Elizabeth Eisenstein and Michael McKeon, among others. I note, too, that the book is both a pleasure to handle, kudos to Penn State Press, and a joy to read, kudos to its author. This was a fun assignment. I learned a lot. Now, I can't pretend in 10 minutes to do full justice to what this book contains. What follows aims to help set the table for our conversation today. The author will follow me, and he will modulate my extremities of summary. I'll also offer 2 observations in closing that might be useful for our common conversation. The letter of prison is, as the author notes at the outset, a genre of religious literature with a distinctive history that is also always already highly contextual. Paul of Tarsus and Martin Luther King both wrote letters from prison, so did Oscar Wilde. Gilpin is keenly aware of this and chooses to focus our attention on a period in England when the genre flourishes and is an explicit ongoing conversation with the wider cultural context. It begins with the reign of Henry VIII and the initial phases of the English Reformation and extends into the 1680s right up to, in an irony he does not announce but I couldn't miss, John Locke's letter concerning toleration. This encompasses the short reigns of Mary and Edward VI and the remarkably lengthy one of Elizabeth I, the execution of Charles I and the ensuing interregnum, and the so-called Restoration with its enthronement of Charles's son, Charles II, in 1660. You get the idea. It is a period of extraordinarily concentrated, explicitly religious turmoil in which liturgy, doctrine, and polity are being regularly reformulated and contested via divergent and intransigent appeals to commonly held authorities of Scripture and tradition. In addition to the established Church of England, this is a world of Catholics, Reformed Protestants, Puritans, and separatists, not to mention immigrant and exile communities, each of which lays fervent claim to represent the one Christian faith. Gilpin invokes this history at the outset, but directs our attention instead to a counterintuitive but indisputable phenomenon: the fact that these contesting, often contentious groups uniformly took recourse to a common genre, the writing and reading of letters written by prisoners of conscience. Gilpin describes this period as one in which, and I quote, "a historical laboratory emerges in a time and place when a substantial number of prison letters were written, disseminated, and became sufficiently influential that members of the public developed expectations about the structure and purpose of the literary form and the symbolic attributes of its author." These letters number more than 1,500, and so far as I can see, our author has read them all, and even some of them twice. Thank you. This conforming practice of non-conforming religionists emerges as a shared genre, hence the phrase religious literature. These letters are first and foremost testimony. They bear witness, they tell the truth in narrative, and in doing so, a central component of Gilpin's analysis, they marry word with deed. The letter is an act, and over this period, Gilpin skillfully traces its generic consolidation as a recognized form, its ready appropriation by different groups, its eventual and in retrospect inevitable emergence into the public arena through print, and via that, the emergence of a set of new challenges and new adaptations that at once preserve while modulating aspects of the form and key elements of its message. Across its myriad practitioners, Gilpin identifies three shared elements of all such letters: a self-portrayal, an implied reader, and an image of the cell in which the letter is composed. This triad gives rise, he says, to two controlling dynamics. One is the identification, on a scale so far as I can discern roughly from presumption to challenge, an identification of writer of the letter with its reader. The second dynamic is the presence of the cell, nicely invoked by our dean, the space from which the author writes. This cell serves at least two functions in Gilpin's analysis. First, it is represented as at once constraining and redemptive, so the cell renders its captive resident free in a way that would not otherwise be possible. Second, the circumstances it bespeaks flips the order of social authority, because this particular location from which the prisoner writes is controlled ultimately not by the temporal magistrate who authorized the imprisonment, but by the eternal God who accompanies the prisoner there and will remain with the prisoner beyond incarceration and death. Like any real genre of religious literature, the letter from prison is hardly static. It has what we might call a history of reception. The story Gilpin tells underscores this with nuance and power. I'll briefly name several of the major developments he describes. Inevitably, there is a preponderance within the genre of letters of farewell. Those writers faced impending death, usually by burning at the stake. These letters of farewell, ostensibly written to a family member, usually a spouse or a child, are, in Gilpin's analysis, in fact, written to a much larger community, a community that will live into a future that the writer himself or herself will not know. They marry to an unusual degree heartfelt domestic sympathies with hard-headed communal purpose. In the process, the letter of farewell itself becomes a venue of transcendence, through which writers form and remain connected to a community that embodies the values enshrined by the prisoner's life and death. A second development concerns the emergence of print culture and its impact on the letter from prison. Newspapers, pamphlets, petitions, indeed the publication of letter collections themselves, expands readerships well beyond the writer's immediate community. This introduces a level of moral complexity. A word like treason sounds very different in the context of a specific religious community than it does when the context includes not only that community but the wider commonwealth. To some degree, this change indexes the ever-shifting priorities of the state, and with it the reversals in which public officials become prisoners themselves and take up the letter from prison as a matter of conscience. Think of our own context in that regard. These prisoners come to argue not for heavenly but for earthly righteousness, protesting their probity in earthly affairs and arguing that they have been imprisoned unjustly simply for fulfilling their earthly duties. A thread throughout the period is the way that letters come to be regarded as having a parallel function to the coffins which will eventually encase the remains of their writers. They are parallel phenomena. Each is a presence that is not present. This is a further index of the ways in which the letter must align the self that is its composer, not only with her, his particular community, but with the Commonwealth. Later in its history, the letter from prison, in part reflecting the particular chaos introduced by the beheading of Charles I and the reign of the Protectorate, expresses felt uncertainty, indeed apprehension about the future, and a kind of resolute clinging to fundamental personal virtue as the sole way to mediate this uncertainty. Events that appear to have spiraled even beyond providential control counsel a return to basic human virtue as the source of rightness before God. Great example of this is King Charles's letter to his son, the icon Basilica. The final, in some ways the most radical development which Gilpin traces in Letters from Prison is the transformation in which the self itself becomes a dungeon or a cell. In an accentuation of the earlier emphasis on imprisonment as the source of truth-telling, its premise is that, per the Quaker George Fox, among others, the only way an individual can experience true freedom is by becoming imprisoned. In this mode, the prisoner of conscience becomes a spiritual practitioner who works toward a state of equanimity about death that is understood to be a divine gift. The prisoner's examination of conscience effectively moves imaginatively out of the prison, even as it is still emphatically in it, toward a view of time as at once local and absolute. In this way, the prisoner scrutinizes the justice of their cause as a matter not only of this moment, but of the truly longue durée of creation, providence, and eschatology. This process of scrutiny accentuates the cell of the prison as itself a text, at once the source of material from which to make letters. The lead from windows was used in place of ink, so was coal. It becomes the courtroom for this individual cultivation. The question of the true church and the false church is transformed here to an interior conflict in which the prisoner's own discipline must align itself with communal solidarity. In its fully realized form, the author suggests in his conclusion, the cause comes to supplant the self as a self. I would have loved 10 more pages, but that's where you end. Some thoughts for possible discussion. The genre of the letter from prison accentuates its situatedness both spatially and temporally. This is assuredly a historical phenomenon, and I wonder if it is also not an idea about what religion is. In this particular historical moment, do these particular letters from prison seek to rein in the religious chaos by stipulating that their writing in this moment at these places is an indisputable witness beyond controversy? And in more general terms, I'm thinking of Paul and of Tarsus and Martin Luther King and even Oscar Wilde. Is there a theory of religion here in which the axis mundi, oops, I'm not supposed to use that phrase, is a shared and disciplined witness that forms communal solidarity across political and social distinctions? Secondly, in a glorious way, this is an uncategorizable book. It's first a history, but it's also a work of literary criticism and a work that engages theology as well. I found myself thinking back to the curriculum that Clark Gilpin stewarded in his years as dean, which sorted our faculty into constructive, historical, and correlative work with the human sciences, all the while insisting that those relations were fluid. Put differently, and in an argot that's more current for us, Gilpin writes at once both about how these remarkable people wrote their letters and why they wrote them, in a way that makes it impossible to do one without doing the other. Is that part of this book's agenda? Anyway, thank you.
Thank you for these two excellent overviews of this book. In an ironic way, it frees me to say what I want to say today about what engages my own mind as I look back on this book. Resisting the religious and moral expectations of the state, the prisoner wrote to address, define, and even transform a contrasting narrative of social solidarity. The prisoner's irrevocable and often fatal decision to testify delivered both a written statement, the letter from prison, and an embodied purpose, the act of witness that in fact is intertwined with this document in the fate that will unfold for them both. The early evangelical John Frith, writing from Newgate Prison in July of 1553, shortly before he was burned for heresy, articulated the question of this testimony with his own question. Why, asked Frith, should one side have all the words and the other be put to silence? Not going to happen. The testimony is an embodied, written act. Directly addressing persons, the letter aimed to demonstrate the witness's truthfulness and ethical character. In order to make this declaration in contrast to the regnant purposes of the state, one had to trust as a reader what was being said. How does one arrive as a reader at this confidence in a person who is raising dangerous ideas? It's an exhortation to respond to a future that is uncertain. It is a declaration that the prisoner's advocacy stands beyond partisanship. It is an effort to speak truthfully. And it generates or seeks to generate a binding dialogue between the writer and the reader. Together, the prisoner's self is transfigured by this fateful decision, and the reader's character is transfigured in the way that the addressee of that letter has received, must confront, and decide what to do. Am I going to walk away from this danger, or am I going to join the person who stood on perceived principle? So the letter from prison is remarkable not only in the ways I've just summarized, my colleagues have just summarized, but also in the decision that arises out of these two people, the writer and the reader and the dialogue that interconnects them, that binds them together, and the decision that each must make, because I'm talking to you, not just anybody. How am I going to respond to this letter? Dear Jeffrey, right? What strikes me about this in particular is the way in which this is a highly, as I said, contingent decision. You're talking about a future that's uncertain, that's unfolding, that has its threatening aspects. What are we going to do? None of us knows for sure. Here is the decision I'm going to make about that future. Where do you stand? The most intriguing part of these letters, as I look back on this piece, is that sense of contingency depends on when the letter was read. Many of these letters, especially in the early days of Henry VIII and following, 16th century, the letters were collected, assembled, autobiographic narratives were added to them, and then a decade or 2 decades later, they were read in collected volumes. Now at that point, you're reading a letter in which at one level you know the outcome. But at another level, this era, this epoch of social transformation means that you cannot elude the faithfulness for which this prisoner died. What am I going to do retrospectively as I look back? By the 17th century, print, the smuggling of print out of cells, especially around the city of London, can happen in a matter of a day or 2 days, and suddenly that letter is on the street, circulating among people, even circulating in demonstrations where the letter will be printed on a casket of somebody who has been executed and marched through the city so that the letter proceeds out of the very moments in which this act occurred. Here, you're still contingent, but in a quite different way. Earlier, the contingency had been, how do I think about the life that this completed testifier lived? Now, I'm living a life in which an advocate from the street is speaking as things unfold, before things have eventuated, and not only is there the contingency of the general contingency, but there is the immediate contingency of, I don't know what's going to happen to a leveler like Richard Overton in 1647, and what's going to happen to me, because neither one of us have decided what's going to occur. So the letter is coming to you at a moment when the contingency of decision, the decision about witness, is not only something that is looked at retrospectively in a completed life, but is looked at actively as Overton, other political advocates of the mid-17th century, and me, must decide, what am I going to do? There are certain things like that that are similar to our own day, it would seem. I want to conclude then by one example, because I think it picks up on a number of themes that elevate these stories, these narratives, these implicit autobiographies. In this case, it's one of these retrospective letters, written in 1554, but not published and circulated for us to read until a decade and a half later. Early in 1554, John Bradford wrote from the Tower of London to his mother, emphasizing that as soon as his family has finished reading this letter, it must be burned. The letter's discovery, Bradford warned, would reveal that he had pen and ink, and this evidence might lead him to be cast into some dungeon of fire. Bradford lamented that in the sight of God he was a grievous sinner, but he rejoiced that God was merciful. Bradford was therefore merry and glad in prison 1 week before his death because of God's merciful presence. And God had chosen him as a witness, and he assured his mother that he would rejoice even more if I could get you to be merry with me. To evoke that shared joy, Bradford incorporated a prayer in the body of the letter he was writing, and he instructed his brother Roger to make a copy of this prayer before the letter was destroyed. "Good mother," Bradford wrote, "mark what I have written and learn this prayer by heart, to say it daily, and then I shall be merry and you shall rejoice." In composing the prayer his mother would recite, Bradford identified them with the prophet Samuel and his mother Hannah, who had dedicated Samuel before his birth to the service of God. The emphasis fell on a life of unswerving fidelity, especially in Bradford's crucial sentence of this prayer to be memorized. He writes, "As Hannah did apply and give her first child Samuel, unto thee, so do I, dear Father, beseeching thee for Christ's sake to accept this my gift, and give my son, John Bradford, grace always truly to serve thee and thy people, as Samuel did." Bradford's letter illustrates several crucial dimensions of prison dialogue that are built around addressing the family or exploring the family as metaphor. First of all, the prayer that Bradford composed for his mother introduced God as a third interlocutor in the prayer. This aspiration to say that I am not saying what I'm saying for my personal compelling reasons. I'm saying them because I seek an uncertain future. The prisoners' dialogue represented not only communication with one another, but also identification with one another, an intimate dialogue in which prisoner and reader correlated their shared emotions, their shared self-discovery. Second, the audiences of prison letters expanded dramatically over the next century after this letter of 1554 was finally published. Hence, the definition of the prisoner's testimony emphasized not simply the truth of the statement, but also the demonstrated trustworthiness of the writer, who in fact stuck with it and died for it. The letter, in short, becomes a halved dialogue in which writer and reader interact and decide, like Bradford and his mother, to live out a life together. This motif appears in virtually every letter from prison. The direct address is an act of engagement. and a decision needs to be reached. What is going to be my response? At that moment, when things are still uncertain, or at a later moment when I see a trustworthy person, but live myself at an uncertain moment? The letter, as it went into print, remained in this form, was often contextualized in different ways, but it was there to be read and reread by different audiences, each audience facing a decision that was contingent within their own lives. And that power, as, for example, when Martin Luther King writes in his famous letter from prison, "Now is the time when the decision must be reached." Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions, comments, discussions, including between the two of you here.
I think it does define religion, because we live at a moment of decision in and for the future, and need to decide not only what to do, but who am I? I'm struck, and I'll editorialize this briefly, I'm struck by the extent to which the identity of writers in America today have reduced the self to the numerical value of that person's wealth. We are what we add up to in an alarmingly literal way. Religion has more to say about who we are than simply our numerical value. And in some ways, that retrieval of that rich dimension of what religion aspires to create around meaning, decision, and an uncertain future is intrinsic to the purpose of testimony, of witness, of embodiment.
Clark, thank you so much. I've been waiting for this book to come out since you first spoke on it to our Religion and Ethics workshop back, I think, in 2011, something like that. So looking forward to eventually reading it. A question, how central is the innocence, whether it be innocence, even if one has violated the rules of the state, as with Martin Luther King, but nonetheless, innocence in terms of character for the work of the letter from prison. And partly behind my question is we're in America in a moment where there's a profound diminishment of the value of those who are in prison, but not certainly a good number of people who are in prison have committed harms. And the reforms that we need to institute today are not necessarily tied simply to being prisoners of conscience, as we see within the letter from prison. So with this genre at this period of time, clearly it is tied to being a prisoner of conscience. Do you see it at all transform in your longer reading, more general reading, to have purchased beyond the space of the at least innocent before God writer from prison?
It's an interesting question, partly because, or largely for me, because the notion of innocence is not an active noun. in this writing. In the 16th and 17th centuries, sinners are very prominent. And again, part of the definition of religion is that we live in an uncertain future where we can make decisions that are distorted by personal gain, by playing with the crowd because it's easier. And so these people begin by saying no, while recognizing that their no is at an underlying or fundamental level a yes. This is the future I see. And the worry about innocence is less there than the search for the nonpartisan decision of the writer. And I think that's why this dialogue with the reader of the letter becomes so important. One of the most capturing sets of letters, hundreds of them, that are written at a point when the prisoner is writing the last letter ever to be written. Death is going to happen within 3 days. What do I want to say with the last thing I'm ever going to say? What is my final word? And that arises, I would say, out of a quest for the innocence that, again, in Bradford's letter to his mother, is given by God, is a gift to you. It's not something you simply possess or don't. But in that last moment, I have to size up honestly, directly, and irrevocably what I have lived for. What has it amounted to? What has it meant? Again, part of the definition, I would say, of what religion is. Am I online with you?
Thank you so much. That's a great.
Yes, I just had two small questions, maybe big questions. One, why are they religious letters, that type of genre? And could you talk more about the genre there? And two, were there non-religious letter genres?
Yes, there are some letters that are, especially by the mid-17th century, you might say marginally religious. John Lilburn, Richard Overton, the mid-17th century levelers, were primarily concerned with revolutionizing, making equal, and making just the House of Commons. So their focused objective was a political objective. It's interesting, though, that when somebody like Overton starts to write, the letter he writes is about the ways in which, when he demands action from the House of Commons, his wife and their infant child are captured on the street and dragged through the city of London to jail. And the narrative becomes a story about an inhumane event happening before my eyes while I'm in prison myself, and my family is being destroyed. And the religious dimension of that begins to appear. It appears in a second way when, as Overton writes, he says, "This decision lies with you in the House of Commons, and I now step back in faithful loyalty to God and await the justice of your decision." So it's a dominatingly political story, but it's also a story about humanity, about responsibility, and about the necessity of people recognizing, again, the justice of what will be done. So religion and the capacity to have faith and call for the faith of others, to live the responsible life, even in letters that are dominatingly political in character. Okay.
Thank you very much. This has been very interesting. I have a question about the journey of these letters to publication.
Journey of these letters.
To publication, both in their own moment and in the present. So I'm just thinking about the story of the letter, and not just the story that's being told in the letter, and what impact that had on the reception of the letters and the messages that were conveyed by them.
Two quick answers that are important to understanding the book as a whole. The first is that although there have been letters out there since the Apostle Paul, at least, this notion of the letter emerges as a literary device, I'll say, that is designed to relate the prisoner directly to another person or group of persons. And that has, again, the kind of transformative political force that they're seeking to arrive at. So that the vast bulk, 1,500, 2,000 such letters, begin to emerge, I would say, with figures like Thomas More in the 1530s. As instruments, I mean, he wrote, for instance, to his daughter, Margaret Roper, but 40 years later, they appear as the last letters between More and his daughter. And that collection does a couple of things that are important in this period. One is that it creates an autobiographic narrative or biographic narrative of the person. So many of these collected letters include, in figures like John Fox, of people who are not only delivering the letters, but caging that letter within a story of who this person is. 50, 90 years later, when people are writing generally, like the levelers, Overton and Lilburn, to a wide group of people whom they may not know directly at all, part of their task, whether you're talking about Catholic prisoners, Protestant prisoners, is to present an autobiographic story to situate your decision and how you arrived at it in your story. So I've got an example I won't go into, but there's some remarkable stories by Jesuit missionaries who have come from Europe to England to evangelize the nation during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. And in order to do so, they have to not simply announce their position, but to tell their story, to situate them within the narrative that helps generate confidence. So there's an interesting way in which, again and again, who the person is an indispensable feature of the development of the letter from prison. And it gets elaborated even in different forms, even when it's written and published directly. Within a month or 6 months of a Jesuit in England in the 1580s. That publication has to include that autobiographic dimension. And that's also a reason where metaphorically it's present in the story I recounted of John Bradford and his mother. I mean, in a way, you're there telling about two people who love one another, who trust one another, and who create a trialogue, not only between themselves, but with the divine. A metaphorical autobiography.
Thank you so much for, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you so much for the conversation here. I confess I've not yet read the book, so I apologize if the answer to what I'm about to say is already well covered there. But I'm curious about the genre of fictional letters from prison in this period, whether they were explicitly recognized as such, or whether they were passed off as letters from prison. And my question is, first, do such things exist? Did such things exist in that time? And second, if they did exist, how does that complicate the understanding of the genre more broadly, either by you or by people at the time consuming this literature?
You may want to say religion and literature. But I'll say myself that I'm reluctant to draw very sharp divisions between fact and fiction. All of these stories selectively put together a decision, an identity, a envisioned future. I mean, the minute you start writing about what transcends now, the fictional dimension is percolating through your story. And in fact, in some ways, that fictional dimension of the future is one of the indispensable parts of the letter from prison. If it doesn't tell the story of what is not yet, it hasn't written a letter. It hasn't written a recognizable letter from prison, because it does not challenge you to respond to what you're reading. So my instinct is to say, if someone in this era, at least, of the 16th and 17th and early 18th centuries, wrote a letter that was absolutely construed from imagination. Leo de Rocher was arrested in, no. These purport to be real letters, and they combine, at least in the ones I read, they combine fact, imagination, and decision intertwined as a single thing. Rick?
Is this on? Can you hear me? Oh, good, okay. I'll be quiet. Lots of, yes, I can hear you. Will, one of the things that your question prompts in me is something I thought about in reading the book, which is there's a lot of interesting work that was done on all the kinds of literature that precede the novel in England and that the novel draws on. So Paul Hunter's book, Before Novels, is about this. And the prison literature Clarke talks about as part of that. And what you see in the novel is a kind of interrogation of your question in a way that I think, as Clarke is signaling, is actually not as big a question earlier. So Defoe's Moll Flanders is a notoriously unreliable writer of letters from prison. but Bill Booth in Fielding's Amelia is completely reliable. Both authors are interested in different ways in the reliability of the letter. But I would go back to Clark's point and say that in neither case are those letters testimonies in the way he's talking about. In other words, they don't presume, and I'm going to use, this is not Clark's language, but it's my reading of Clark, they don't presume a kind of vision of creation, providence, and eschatology. They're really focused on the moment. And it becomes a question of the veracity of the particular account of the situation there. So what Defoe and Fielding are thinking about is something a little bit different, which is, can I verify this claim now? So they borrow on that tradition of the prison letter, but they transmogrify it.
Clark, I was actually thinking about, can you hear me okay? Yes. I'm sorry? No, you're good. Go. I was actually thinking about what's gained from a kind of collective analysis of these letters, both in terms of testifying to the tyranny of the state, like asserting oneself being faithful to one's conscience and so on. But I'm curious, given that this is a period of sort of fierce religious division. After all, people are being burned at the stake. I wonder though about what might be, I don't know if I want to say lost, but what might be overlooked in terms of particularity. And that is to say, are there certain distinctives, if we were thinking about differences between, say, Quakers and Catholics or Presbyterians? I mean, is there something kind of maybe distinctive that comes out where there's, I don't know, more heightened emphasis on the conscience by some? The reason I thought about that was not just because of the diversity of religious groups, but I was also fascinated with the discussion of Bradford writing to his mother and sort of reversing the role where Samson is being dedicated by Hannah, but he's asking his mother. There's something, seems to me, that's very intimate and particular about that letter. I know you talk about the direct audience and then the kind of imagined audience, but in this particular instance, he's asking his mother to do something that's really interesting. And I was just sort of curious to hear more about that, but that made me think more broadly, though, about the question about what might be overlooked, or are there distinctives in terms of like the particular traditions that these individuals are speaking out of? Because you're looking at this collectively, and I understand what's being gained by that, but I was just wondering if there were distinctives or particularities that you notice in your analysis.
So we're going to, the way I got at this question in the first place was by recognizing in courses I taught here at the Divinity School every year, in which Martin, Marty, and I completely transformed the reading assignment for the quarter, with one exception. Marty insisted that every year we read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Otherwise, whole new set of readings. And I got to thinking, you know, I've read lots of individual letters. I've read entire books about individual letter writers from prison. Nelson Mandela, I mean, you can go down the list. Adam Mitchnick, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I mean, volumes have been written about one person's letters. And I got curious, what if we thought about these as an assemblage? Does it disclose anything that you might not find simply by reading the prominent letters of a single prisoner somewhere in time, going back to Boethius in the early centuries of the Christian era? And what I discovered during a research leave at Union Theological Seminary was that there are somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 such letters. I quit reading or counting at that point because it was wearing me out. But I wanted to see exactly this question. Do these things add up to something different that we might not recognize simply by reading an important letter that Joseph Smith, Mormon leader, wrote from jail, et cetera, et cetera. And I think my conclusion, or the thing that struck me, was that these are letters, and this is why the book ends the way it does. These, in the final chapters, become letters about self-transformation. Yeah. The collective sense of who I am. And there's some remarkable contemporary scholars who conclude on this theme that I actually like very much, that at this last moment of self-transformation, the prison writer says, I am writing about who I have not yet been. That this future and the story that it comes from is a story about and this is ironic because of all of this responsibility that these prison letters keep talking about. Well, they go back and pick up the story of the story of the nativity of Jesus, where the shepherds suddenly throw aside everything, leave all their responsibilities. God will take care of the children. God will wash the dishes. I'm quoting here from their letter. And walk away to seek a moment of wonder, a transformative moment of wonder. And so part of the end of life, often literally the end of life for these figures, is not simply resilience, determination, but wonder of insight, of living the life I have not yet been. Again, that aspirational, explicitly, I would say, religious dimension of the letter writer. And I find there a story about these letters that was not evident to me in the various letters written at various times by various people. Let's say from Paul and Boethius to contemporary Russian prisoners. This sense of self-transformation that is pivotal to the letter. I mean, you hear decisions made in individual letters scattered around, but when I work through these 2,000 letters, this sense of self-transformation and becoming the person I have not yet been really stands out in a quite remarkable way. And that's why the last dozen pages end the way they do. Mm-hmm. Is that?
Yeah.
So thank you very much for this. My question sort of starts where you've just left off, which is to say, you've been talking about testimony and self-expression, ambition as sort of central to these letters. You've also talked about reception, and especially intended reception for these letters and the way that they're collected and published. Can you talk more about the actual social effects, the reception that these letters have had historically among their readers? Has it had social effects? What kinds of effects have occurred in response to and in the reception of these letters?
Yeah, let me talk about it in two examples. One comes from the collectors of the letters that were written in the era of Henry VIII, Mary, the early reign of Elizabeth. And there, the response to those collected letters of the 1550s, 60s, 70s are dramatic because, in an interesting way, they celebrate the people who were brave enough during the reign of King Henry to go against the grain and create the Protestant Church of England that we now have. They were the founders. They were the Thomas Jeffersons of their time, and or some other person you want to pick. So yes, it had a huge impact because in a way it was an affirmation of the era in which they lived, the era of Queen Elizabeth. Of course, Catholics on the scene had a somewhat different view of that.
Papists.
Papists, yeah, the papists.
Get 'em right.
Later on, it's interesting, and here contemporary sociologists like Judith Butler are helpful in showing how the letters from prison that are being written in the very moment in which the decisions are occurring are often aligned with public protests. I mentioned earlier carrying a casket with the letter written on the side of the casket to the judge who had rendered the decision as a protest against. So there, the impact is the impact of people making a decision now about a moment that is still under huge threat. And not that these are mutually exclusive, but they're different accents within English society. One during the late 16th century in which a large number of people are celebrating the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Another in the reign of the mid-17th century, when the challenge is what is going to become of the House of Commons, of the representation of the people, and what do we need to do to get their attention? Again, back to the old quotation, why should one side have all the words and the rest be put to silence? And they refuse to be silent.
Can I add something there?
Yeah.
I really appreciate the question, and I want to come at it from a slightly different angle. I think one of the things Clark's book does really well is fill in why Hobbes and Locke wrote what they wrote. Mm-hmm. So, so much of the scholarly discussion of Hobbes and Locke focuses on the question of the divine right of kings and the social contract. But if you read Clark's book, you begin to peel that back, and you realize just exactly what kind of chaotic competing interests were at play, and what Hobbes in particular was terrified of. And so I think another effect of these letters is to create an environment in which a social contract that can cohere and allow voices, to use your phrase, not to be silenced, but also not to dominate over one another, can be created. Not that it's done perfectly or well, et cetera, but I think that is another effect of it that is underestimated a lot.
Yeah, in a long story, we're on the way toward the separation of church and state.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Which was totally inconceivable.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you very much for the talk so far. To what extent, though, does the literature mentioned in your book relate to, say, literature or epistolary literature coming out of other penal areas, like a penal colony such as Australia, or an area with, say, enforced scrutiny such as Ireland? Are there the same kinds of letters that are coming out? Is there the same kind of literature that's being published and distributed? Or is this a phenomenon that's very rooted in the context that's coming from in the book, as you describe?
Well, no, to me, I mean, I haven't done the investigation, but clearly there are letters from prison emerging from Southern Africa, etc. And it would be I guess I would say without my own personal information, I would be stunned if we didn't see some interaction among these literary forms. But I can't speak to it directly. But the environment, the goal, and the capacity from a limited power structure are so similar that if you couldn't draw some comparisons, it would be, well, it would be a huge surprise to me. Every one of these will have its own idiosyncrasies because they are addressing a very particular environment. But one advantage to this, my effort in this book, is that I deal with 150 years, and I deal with multiple examples, thousands of examples, across a time of significant change. And some patterns do emerge. So, I would love to see some examples of analysis of that sort of thing, because I think the issues are so fundamental that I would hope there's an exchange, but not identity.
You know, one of the things that your question prompts me to say is I'm a big fan of Hilary Mantel and loved reading Wolf Hall and the other books, Bring Up the Bodies and whatnot. But I have to say that having read Clark's book, I can't think of Thomas More the same way. Because so many of these figures in this book come across in all their sort of willful contrariety in ways that really do defy the kind of revisionist histories that make More into the captious, weaselly guy Mantell makes him, vis-a-vis the classic portrait in A Man for All Seasons of the highly principled person who was never affected by any detail of his life and wedded himself entirely to it. Thomas More here in this focused context is some of both. I mean, there's that beautiful scene late in the book when he's writing to his daughter, which is extraordinarily moving. And then there are these earlier scenes where, he's like, I'm standing on precedent, this is it. And I think the comparative question is a really important question. I think the value of the focus here, for me at least in the reading, was the kind of extraordinary nuance of personality that emerges, where, you see Thomas More in various aspects at various points. It's quite powerful, I think.
More is one of the examples of people who have surprising courage to stand in front of the highest officials of the realm and say, no. I mean...
You like that.
He
may have been a dean, but he likes to say no to authority.
So.
And speaking as someone who works in a different tradition, I think this book, from the comparative perspective, really provides a peg. It provides a foundation to start to look at other traditions comparatively.
Comparative, yeah.
And with that, I want to thank the two of you. Thank you very much.